Hello everyone, Lytro Storm here, and today I'm going to be beginning yet another Telltale Walking Dead What If. We all know Molly basically showed up, helped the game through Crawford, and then randomly chose to leave or got shot by Lee. So today we'll be asking what would happen if she actually stayed with the group. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get straight into the video. So the what if would pick up with Molly getting attacked by the walkers just like in canon. There are multiple different outcomes here this time. Lee can shoot the walker, saving Molly, or if you brought Clementine to Crawford, then she can do it instead. The two bad outcomes are Lee either shooting Molly or not shooting the walker, thus leaving Molly behind. These both leave her survival as ambiguous, as she never comes back, so we'll keep that a constant. So the only way to make this story happen is by either having Lee or Clem save Molly. Lee can then choose to drop Ben or pull him up, and we continue from there. Upon arrival at the house, everyone would talk, but unlike in the original, Molly would still plan to stay and get on the boat. Vernon talks to Lee about Clem. Lee tells her that they can't look for her parents, and in the morning, she would be missing. Lee then gets bitten by a walker, and the whole group would roll up outside. Of course, our main character then has to recruit people to go with him to find Clem. For Omid, Krista, Kenny, and Ben, their requirements to go with would still be the same. However, Molly's requirements are the interesting part. If you saved her before, then she will go with you. However, if Clementine saved her, she would refuse, as she doesn't want to put her life in the hands of someone who couldn't protect her before. She would instead stay at the house with whoever else was there, or no one if you managed to get everyone to go with you. From there, everything up until the point where they return to the house would be the same, though it's likely that if everyone was left behind, they would be a little less beat up since Molly is a skilled fighter. Regardless, the boat would be gone, and the group would be forced to make a final stand in the house. Molly would be the first to suggest the attic, considering she didn't even have a gun, so she would be the first one looking for a way out. This would lead to all of them surviving and making it into the attic. Everything would go the same, with Molly likely helping break down the wall once Kenny and Lee are done arguing. The group jumps to the other building, and the balcony would fall under Molly. Thankfully, she's a little lighter than Ben, so she manages to jump across and use Hilda to pull herself up. If you have Ben with you, there will be no option but to try and climb down and go through the alley. He ends up accidentally injuring himself on the spike, not seeing it, so Lee and Kenny go to help him. Once they find the severity of the wound and that walkers are approaching, Kenny stays behind to put Ben out of his misery. If you didn't have Ben though, then he would sacrifice himself to pull Krista back up. Basically, that just stays the same as in the original game. So now Kenny is gone either way, and so is Ben if you had him. Molly would also help Krista, considering she has Hilda to help reach. But in the end, the group would be separated from Lee, and he would make Molly, Krista, and Omid promise to keep Clementine safe. They do so with Molly actually taking her first real objective besides her own survival. She swears to Lee, and he would later meet the same fate as in canon, with Clementine escaping and eventually meeting up with the remaining group. So we now cut up to season 3, where Molly would be with Omid, Krista, and Clementine. Here, Molly would be in the girls' room with Clem to leave Omid and Krista alone together. This means that the one chick who showed up wouldn't pull up or would be forced away from the group. Or if for some reason you want to say she stays, maybe it ends up as Clem's choice or something, then she probably wouldn't last very long or would just try and steal something from them and leave. So we can do the time jump of 16 months, and now the 4 are in the woods, and sadly Krista and Omid's baby would still have not made it. I honestly don't see it making too much sense for me to assume it would work out. I had it be born in What If Javier was in season 1, check that out by the way, but there, Kenny and Katja were also there to help out, and those two are literal parents who had already gone through this once, so I don't see it making it this time. The group would still be mourning that loss, especially Krista. Molly would volunteer to go get more wood, but Krista would say that she's got it, and Omid would follow to make sure she's okay. Molly and Clementine talk a little bit about the couple and what Molly thinks about Wellington. In her mind, she thinks it's just going to be another Crawford. It might not be the exact same, but there's always a catch to these safe havens. Then they hear Krista and Omid in a distance and chase after the sound. The two sneak around, seeing the two being surrounded by men aiming their weapons. Molly would then suggest for her and Clementine to run, wanting to keep her promise to Lee to keep Clem safe. Clem then gets the choice to either run or shoot one of the guys since she would still have her gun, and Molly would have trained her up on survival a little bit more. If the two yell, then you would hear Omid yell Krista's name before a gunshot would proceed, with Krista screaming. If you shoot one of them, then there would be a distraction, leading to Krista yelling for Clementine to run. This would be followed by a gunshot with Omid screaming instead. The two then run away, fighting off the bandits, which would go much easier and would eventually be forced into the water stream. Clementine wakes up the next day and hears Molly trying to make sure she's alright. Clem would ask what they should do, which would make Molly realize her weird new position. With Krista and Omid gone, she was now the sole protector of Clementine and would have to lead her. She's never had to do this, so it would be a really interesting dynamic and character arc for Molly to start. She's already agreed to be Clementine's protector, but before Krista and Omid were there, so they just did whatever they did. But now, she's alone. And given that Molly isn't one to accept responsibilities like this, it's a big moment for her. So after Clem asks what they should do, Molly would awkwardly say, "Right," and then suggest that they search around. So they do, finding the dog and some food, which leads to it attacking and getting killed after biting Clem. Molly would then have to take even more care of Clem, immediately making her position even worse and carrying her through the walker-infested woods. They meet Pete and Luke, who Molly would explain the dog bite to. In the optional dialogue, Luke says that they don't know the difference between a dog bite and a mosquito bite. And Molly would respond to that there's a pretty big difference to screw up on. Anyway, the four make it back to the house, where the group would decide to put Clem in the shed. Molly protests against this, calling Carlos dumb for not knowing a human bite mark from a dog, and she would say that she's staying in the shed too, which Alvin would suggest not to do. If Clem really does turn, then being stuck in there might not be a good idea, especially in the middle of the night when you're probably going to fall asleep. However, Carlos replies to let her do whatever she wants. It's her choice. The two would then get locked up, with Molly letting Clem sneak back into the house while she looks around for stuff in the shed. She would eventually return, and Molly would actually be the one stitching Clementine up, which, again, pretty big deal for Molly. If he got the juice box from Alvin, then Molly would say okay nervously before taking a drink of it before she starts. Clementine gets all stitched up, and a walker busts in, but Molly is able to handle it using Hilda. The cabin group would then pull up, hearing all the commotion, and Molly and Clem would show how cool they are before coming inside for dinner. During this time, Molly would tell Carlos not to cradle his daughter, as she needs to be able to survive on her own. Carlos gets angry about this, and this further expresses his dislike of Molly. In the morning, Pete and Nick take the two out, and they get attacked by walkers. Clem chooses who she wants to go with, and Molly goes for the other, ending episode 1. Episode 2 begins and goes the same way for Clem and whoever she went with. However, Molly's path would have some slight alterations. If she went with Pete and Lee cut off his arm in the first season, then she would unknowingly tell Pete that chopping off his leg wouldn't work. Of course, Pete would know that it could because he had seen it before, but he ultimately doesn't have the will to do so. Molly would tell him to do it if he works, as there's no point in letting yourself die. However, Pete would argue that there's nothing to stop the bleeding, and plus with them being surrounded by the dead, it would just end up in his death anyway. The two then wait the time out, although Molly would grow impatient, telling Pete that she was going to go and that he could come with if he wanted to. He would decline, and Molly would make no further attempts, choosing to leave him immediately. Now, if you ended up going with Pete and Molly went with Nick, then she will get fed up with this crybaby nonsense and tell him to grow up. He responds by saying that he had to kill his mom, and this would put things into perspective for Molly. However, she does still tell him that now he has to go on and survive, but he would stay and sulk, so she leaves him behind as well. Clementine would then return to the house around the time that Molly was about to leave to search for her. The group decides to go after Luke and Alvin, who went looking for Pete and Nick. While they wait, Molly would make Clementine train Sarah in how to use a gun. You can either be against this, not wanting to get in worse with Carlos, or you can agree and do so. Either way, Molly will force you to do it, and you'll show her how to aim and hold it properly. She'd do it herself, but Clementine is Sarah's new friend, so it'd be better coming from her. Clem would then suggest going outside to shoot something, but Molly replies that if the group comes back, they'll get busted pretty easily. However, that's when a knock is heard at the door, and Molly would sneak up to it. The man would then open it himself, and Molly would stand with Hilda aimed. The man who had knocked would be trying to see if he could come inside the house, but Molly isn't gonna let him. She tells him to leave right now or he'd regret it, and even though he presses on with his talking, she cuts him off every time and eventually forces him to go. The group would return with Nick, and the girls would say that a man showed up who the group knew as William Carver. They knew that they had to get out of there now, and so they packed all their stuff and left. Molly would tell Carlos that now would be the great time to get Sarah ready for the world, as they're leaving their comfort zone. However, Carlos would once again just say no, and this would just make Molly more angry. A few days pass and they would pull up to the bridge, only Molly would go with Luke and Clem this time. They meet Matthew, but Nick would still shoot him. Molly yells at Nick and says that someone like him is only going to cause more problems. This would make Nick angry and he would storm off, but he would be visibly sad too. Luke says that he'd talk to him, but Clementine steps up instead. She walks back and get a few new dialogue options. She could be angry about what he did, more understanding, or stay silent. If you're angry, then he would just walk away from her to catch up with the group, but if you're understanding, then he thanks her and promises to try and change himself. Eventually, they would all make it up to the ski lodge, where Molly would tell Clementine that she needs to come see this. She would step forward and see the Christian man himself, Kenny.
And I am a Christian man.
After arriving at the ski lodge, Clementine sees Kenny and the two would embrace. The night would basically go the same, but with Kenny saying he wasn't sure if Molly would stick around, but he's very glad that she did. Being able to see Clementine safe again really just made things better for him. He would also apologize for trying to jump Molly all that time ago in season 1, so that's kind of nice of him, I guess. But anyway, the gang all enjoy themselves until walkers start pulling up. Here, Molly helping out would lead to Nick surviving no matter what instead of it being a choice, as while she doesn't like the guy, she's also not going to let him die. After that, Carver and his men arrive and get everyone tied up. Molly and Clem would be with Rebecca and Alvin, and so as Clem, you can choose to go look for Kenny or Luke, or stay hidden. Molly will follow you wherever you go to ensure that Clementine stays safe. In the end, Walter would be killed and you can choose whether or not you let Kenny shoot again. If you do, then Alvin dies. Here, the three of you would give yourselves up, and Carver would take Hilda. He admires the weapon and says that since Molly was so annoying back at the cabin, he's gonna take this now. After getting everyone tied up, Carver then forces everyone to go to House. On the other side, if Clem and Molly turn themselves in, then Carver would take Hilda right there. Molly would try and undo Carlos's bindings, so he ends up punching Carver in the face. This makes Carver pretty angry, so he uses Hilda and stabs him in the eye. Carlos survives, but he is in agony at this pain. Kenny shooting at them would still remain the same, though Molly would try and protect Clem if she saves Alvin. She does still get taken down anyway, since they're all at gunpoint though. Kenny is forced to give up, and so everyone gets taken to House either way, but this time Carlos has a cool eye. Throughout the third episode of season 2, I don't see too much changing at first. Molly would be at House and would be angry trying to help them all escape. She is made to work separate from Clementine so that Carver can try and take Clem under his wing. When the walkie-talkie plan is found out, Molly would try to take the blame, but Kenny does it instead. She would be very thankful towards him and actually feel kind of bad for Kenny when he gets beaten up for it. But I do still think she's advocating for leaving without him since he's injured now. But they don't have to since Kenny is still kicking. He joins them in their plan to escape, with the only difference being that Molly takes Hilda from Carver after Kenny shoots him. She then leaves Kenny to do whatever he wants, as she isn't going to waste her time trying to negotiate. When Jane shoots Troy and leaves him for the walkers, Molly is actually kind of impressed. They eventually get separated, with Molly joining Clem, Jane, and Rebecca. So Rita and Carlos both die, and Nick gets shot in the shoulder here too. When Rebecca gets angry at Jane, Molly would be telling her to calm down. She had lost her own sister, so Rebecca bringing that subject up ticked her off. But luckily, they eventually make it back to the rest of the group, and when Kenny is mad at Clem, Molly defends her. She tells him to lay off, as she just did what she thought was right in the moment regarding Sarita. The two then join Jane in looking for Sarah, Nick, and Luke. When Jane starts telling them about their group falling apart, Molly sees her points and thinks on it. If the group is gonna fall, then maybe her getting out of there would save Clem. Anyway, the three girls find Nick as a walker, and Clementine kills him. They then move on and try to save Sarah and Luke. Molly holds the walkers off while Jane, Luke, and Clem try to find a way out. Molly wants to save Sarah as she wasn't able to save her sister, so she's not gonna let another little girl die. So when she hears Jane tell Clem to leave her, she kicks it into high gear and slaps Sarah herself. So no matter what, Sarah makes it out alive. Molly tells her that she's sorry afterward and tries to encourage her to keep going. After that, she marches to Jane and asks her what the deal was. She's ready to leave a little girl to die a brutal death, and Molly is not down for that whatsoever. At that point, Jane reveals her own backstory, saying that she was forced to leave her sister behind. This makes Molly even more angry and causes her to reply that she didn't have a choice with her own sister, but Jane did, and she let her die anyway. Jane defends herself, saying that she didn't know what else to do, but Molly just isn't hearing it. After an argument, the five make it back to the group, and Molly goes with Clem to the observation deck instead of Jane. If they get put into a bad situation, she knows Jane would leave Clementine behind, so she's not gonna let that happen. When Arvo shows up, they'd have pretty much the same scene, with Molly filling Jane's role. The only difference is that she probably isn't gonna threaten Arvo in the end, and even says that she's sorry if they end up robbing them. Since Jane wasn't doing that, she would have helped Mike and Bonnie instead of Clem. So the gang are eventually forced to go onto the observation deck to survive after the walker horde pulls up. Luckily, Molly's skills, as well as having Hilda there as a pry bar, would save Sarah from falling off the deck this time, so she survives. AJ is born and Jane leaves. The gunfight with the Russians occurs, and Rebecca dies, ending season 4. Also, Molly would probably be advocating to leave immediately, but she might honestly choose to stay as well. I could see it either way since there is a baby. After that, the gang deals with the Russians and Jane even returns in the end, though Sarah would have been shot and would bleed out after the fight was over. Jane apologizes to Molly, saying that she's sorry that she died, but Molly turns and tells her not to talk. If she'd had died before, she wouldn't have cared at all. The group moves on, and the last of that day would end up the same, just with Molly being someone you have to make join the campfire. To do that, you have to talk to her and remind her that Sarah wasn't her fault, and that they'll make it through. If this succeeds, Molly joins the group at the campfire. If you end up not succeeding, Jane sees Clementine's failure and tries to talk to her again, leading to Molly pushing her before storming off. The next day, Luke and Bonnie fall into the ice, and if Clem tries to save them, Molly grabs her. She doesn't want her risking her own life, but their combined weight makes them fall in, and so Bonnie is saved either way. You can either end up saving Bonnie with Clem and potentially Molly freezing, or not save Bonnie. Either way, Luke's a goner though. The rest of the episode goes about the same, with Molly also agreeing with Kenny that they should go to Wellington. This is due to her being on the road with Krista and Clem, so they had also heard about Wellington during this time, as Krista did in the original game. Mike, Arvo, and potentially Bonnie then all pack up to leave at night, with Clem trying to stop them. This leads to Arvo shooting Clem, which makes Molly, Kenny, and Jane all rush out of the house. Thankfully, she survives and wakes up in the truck next to Molly. Molly is very happy that she lived, but when Kenny and Jane start arguing, Molly is repeatedly making Jane shut up. She's literally her biggest hater here. And you could even see that Molly and Kenny were I was kind of building that up so that way they could kind of be on the same side here, especially now that Molly and Jane are at odds. They're going to Wellington, and that's final. Eventually, Kenny storms off to look for a way around all the cars, and walkers begin approaching. Molly drives, but they end up crashing, and so Jane takes AJ. Molly and Clem escape and try to look for Jane, and they make it to the rest stop and see Kenny, and Jane returns. She doesn't have AJ though, which scares everybody. Molly goes with Kenny to look around, but they don't end up finding him. This leads to Kenny going back and trying to fight Jane. And also, Jane gives Clementine the same warning that she did in canon. Molly tries to stop Kenny from fighting, saying that they shouldn't waste any more lives, but Kenny knocks her aside. He and Jane's battle begins, with Molly and Clem helping out when one of them has the upper hand. And if we're being honest here, Molly was able to kick the crap out of Kenny and also fight pretty much on par with Lee, depending on the version you take. So Molly helping out against Kenny would be kind of useful. She doesn't want to risk her own life, as she has to protect Clem as well. And so when Kenny tries killing Jane at the end, Molly sits aside. She had already tried to save them both, but they just continued fighting, so it was pointless. The choice does still come down to Clementine because of this, who can either shoot Kenny or look away like Molly. If she looks away, then Kenny kills Jane and they find AJ. Molly says that Kenny is way too unhinged, as her helping him didn't even make him stop. He apologizes, promising to work on it. This offer can either be accepted by Clem, or she and Molly can leave him behind, out of fear that what he's done is too much. If they go with him, then they go to Wellington, but only Clem and AJ are accepted to go since they're kids. If Clem chooses to go, she leaves Kenny and Molly and joins Wellington with AJ. And if not, then she stays with everybody. So if you choose this ending, everything from here on out pretty much goes the same, since it's just Clem and AJ going forward. If you don't go to Wellington, then the three of you leave with AJ. And if you leave Kenny behind, we'd see Clem and Molly work together to go through a herd after covering themselves in guts. Anyway, going back to the initial choice of shooting Kenny, if you do so, then Jane would thank you. Molly hears AJ, and so she rushes after the noise with Clementine. Clementine catches up with her only to see Molly's face in shock, and that shock quickly turns to malice. Jane approaches and Molly says that she'd better have a good explanation. Jane says that she knew Kenny would react that way, so she set it up to protect Molly and Clem. Clementine looks at Jane and sees Hilda stabbed through her head. Clem then looked up at Molly, who was visibly angry as she took Hilda out of Jane's face. Clementine is shocked because of this, and Molly justifies herself between heavy breaths. She says that Jane left her sister to die, she tried to leave Sarah to die, and now she forced Clem to kill Kenny. There was no way they were going to keep her in the group. She would have just given up on them too, and Molly won't take that. She has to keep her promise to Lee. And so now, because of this action, Clementine has a new choice to either go with Molly still or leave her behind because she pretty much just murdered Jane. Like, even if you think it's justified, it's still murder. Jane didn't try and put up a fight. If this does end up being too much for your Clementine and you choose to leave her behind, Molly would try and stop her, but she can't bring herself to force Clementine to stay, as if recognizing that what she did probably was a bit too much. So Clem takes AJ and then goes off on her own. But if Clem stays with her, then they get the same ending where they survive together with AJ. So basically, in this version, you don't get to stay with Jane no matter what. She's dying at the end of season 2. Sorry. So for A New Frontier, we've got 2 different backstories for Clementine. She's either with Molly or with Molly and Kenny. If she's with Molly, then nothing changes from the Alone version other than Clem gets to keep her fingers because Molly is there to have her back. If she's with Molly and Kenny, then Kenny still gets paralyzed by a car crash and dies, leaving only Molly and Clem anyway. Sorry to the Kenny fans, but this is probably the most realistic outcome, let's be real. I don't think Molly being there is going to make Kenny wear his seatbelt. They would at some point be found by Ava, who tells them of the New Frontier. Molly is skeptical of this group, so she doesn't want to go, but Clem is up to your choice. But I do think no matter what, they will still end up joining them out of desperation. That's what Clem did in the actual game, even if you deny it, so I think that it's probably not too far-fetched. But when they deny AJ medicine, Molly becomes furious. This is the same stuff they did at Crawford, throwing out the sick, elderly, and children. Molly makes a plan to steal the supplies, but does it without Clem. So when she is caught, Clem and AJ get to stay safe while she leaves. This is the best way for them to be safe, as staying out on the road won't do them any good, and Molly's also been questioning whether or not she's good enough to protect Clem due to the events of Season 2's ending. On top of that, a toddler's needs are way too specific for them to keep AJ alive out there. Clementine can either respect Molly's wishes or not. If she doesn't, then Molly yells at her and says that she has to keep her promise. The promise to Lee to keep Clementine safe no matter what. So, in the end, Clementine is forced to stay with the New Frontier, and this means that Molly is basically taking up Clementine's role in the original Season 3. Now that she's been exiled from the New Frontier, she's going to be roaming around just trying to survive, basically out on her own once again, which I think is really cool because it's her going back to how she was before. Right after just having to develop all these skills to keep Clementine safe as well and watch over AJ as well, and after losing so much and doing so much else in Season 2. However, the downside of this is that because of how similar Season 3 Clem is to Molly in this situation, I really don't see anything changing this season. It really sucks to say, but when you look at Molly, how she was before she met Clem, and then you look at Clem in Season 3, Clem is basically on her own again, and she tries to push away her feelings and emotions and tries to push away other people so she can keep herself alone. Now, Molly in Season 1 is a bit more hardened, where even then she really didn't seem to care about most people, even after she joined the group, but now she's had literal years protecting Clementine and growing bonds with other people like Kenny and whatnot, if you had him. So her being on her own now is also going to feel kind of bad, and she's going to try and shove that away, but also eventually come to terms with the fact that she does need other people. So it's still a cool character arc, but unfortunately it's the same character arc Clem has this season. So like, yeah. Obviously there would be dialogue differences because it's Molly, but Clem was all stoic and on her own, which is how Molly would be as well. So just imagine the whole season, but with Molly replacing Clem. I know this really sucks to say, but like, I'm trying to keep things realistic, and I don't want to have to cover all the events of Season 3 with like the tiny little dialogue changes and whatnot. So I'll just give you guys some things that change overall with the season so we can move forward. The main differences I'd see is that Molly doesn't use guns often since she has Hilda, so she wouldn't kill that guy who gave Clem faulty bullets. This means her and Javi don't get locked up, but that really isn't all too important. And maybe we could even see Molly use a gun once or twice just to see like her reaction to it and whatnot, and see if she's actually good with it, or maybe you could have a gag where she's like really bad with guns, or she just doesn't like them in general. I don't know, but we're about to go into the final season, which has basically no guns, so if we're gonna have that for her, it needs to be in this season. Additionally, when Molly asks Lingard where AJ is, she'd also be asking for Clem as well. You could even have her choose to go after Gabe and David, or save Richmond based on Clem's flashbacks still. Or you can base it on the ending Clem got in Season 2. Either way, hopefully nobody gets upset about me kind of glossing over Season 3. I just really don't see a need to go into every small detail if it all ends up the same. So I'm skipping to the stuff where things actually change to keep it interesting for you guys. I understand if it kind of feels like a cop-out, but this is just the way it is. I try to keep things realistic, I'm sorry. But anyway, now that I've made that caveat, let's go ahead and continue on to Season 4. When Molly leaves Richmond to go off to McCarroll Ranch and find Clem and AJ, this will be similar to how Clem did it. However, the key difference is that Clem would be defending the ranch alongside Eddie and the others, since she would be part of the New Frontier. So Molly and Clem both see each other, and Clem stops Eddie from firing on Molly. And what does this mean? Eddie will survive. Clementine explains that they're under attack and that they need to get AJ out of there. So Eddie joins the group, and he, Clem, and Molly enter the nursery and find the one woman Clem did in canon. They tell her that they need to escape, so she lets them take AJ in the car and says that she'll hold the enemies off. The gang leaves, with Molly reuniting with AJ and getting to know Eddie over this course of time. I honestly think Eddie becoming a main character, just because Molly stayed with the group, is really cool, as it takes what we got from 400 Days and actually takes a little Easter egg that we got in the final season and makes it actually mean something. So it's not just like, oh hey, there's Eddie, and then Clem kills him. Now he's actually with the gang. It's just like a neat little thing that doesn't really happen often in What Ifs. I really like when things like this happen. And so some time passes and we see a grown-up Clem driving with Molly beside her and Eddie and AJ in the back seats. AJ is gonna feel a lot safer due to having 2 extra people defending him all these years, so I doubt he'd be as edgy as he was originally. The 4 stop at a train station, eventually getting attacked by walkers and being saved by Marlon and Violet. They get taken back to the school where they all regroup and meet everyone. From there, the night plays out the same for the most part. Although, one thing I really didn't mention in my What If Lee and What If Kenny Survived thing is that this group doesn't really like adults. I had kind of left that out. I kind of forgot, I'll be real. So I do think that they would be distant to the adults whenever they save them, but I do still think that they would save them because they're not gonna just pick up Clem and AJ and then just steal them and then leave the adults behind. That's really weird, especially because it could make them enemies. So when they are there, they're just gonna be a little awkward at first, but obviously throughout those 2 stories, Lee and Kenny, they grow to appreciate each other more and bond and help each other to defeat the raiders. And the same thing would be said here. Everybody wouldn't like Molly at first because she's an adult and they all have prejudice against them, but eventually they would grow to like her and Eddie. So yeah, just a cool thing I thought I would cover that I had forgotten to cover in previous What Ifs where things like this has happened. Moving on. The next day, Clem and AJ would either go hunting or go fishing. Eddie and Molly do whatever Clem chose not to do. After that, they realize that they didn't have enough, so they make a plan to go back to the train station. Molly would be the one to notice the bell and mention how they're going old school for this one. She picks up the bell and gives it to Lewis, telling him to make noise to attract the walkers. Then her, Clem, and AJ push forward, with Eddie and Violet keeping watch. As the 3 were gathering the food, they would hear a struggle outside. Molly tells Clem and AJ not to stop getting the food and runs out to see what's going on. Eddie and Violet are both fighting off some guy who we know as Abel. Half of the walkers that Lewis was distracting begin approaching them due to the struggle, so Molly tells Violet and Eddie to fend them off. Molly is forced back in, and so Abel tells her what he wants. He wants some of the food, or he's gonna shoot her. AJ comes up with his gun held, and so Molly now pushes Abel out of the window pretty much immediately. After that, she tells Clem and AJ to get the bags and start running. As they go outside, Molly saves Eddie from a few walkers, and they run to the school. But along the way, Eddie reveals that he had been bitten on the arm. He and Violet had to fend off a lot of walkers for a long time, so it makes sense that one of them would be bitten. Ollie then says that they should remove it, as they know it would work based on Reggie. They can cut it off now and risk him dying of blood loss or walkers due to his screams, or they can wait until they get to the school, but the map shows that it's going to be a long way from where they came, so it might be too late by then. This leaves Clementine with a choice to make. If they cut it off now, then the group is chased by a lot of walkers, but they leave after a certain bit. Gang makes it to the school where Eddie is patched up properly by Ruby and needs a lot of rest. If Clementine didn't cut it off, then they would go to the school and do it right away. Eddie is then taken by Ruby here as well. But either way, Brody is going to be even more angry, and Marlon is as well. Sure, they got a lot of food, but they found someone, and one of them got bitten. Clementine and Molly put their group in direct danger. It could have easily been Violet in Eddie's position. But they enjoy their meal and go to bed, hoping that Eddie is okay. Clementine wakes up after hearing Marlon and Brody arguing and goes to check it out. After Clem sees them, Marlon kills Brody and traps her down there. Clem is able to escape and sees the whole group is outside with Marlon. He's telling them that Clementine murdered Brody. Molly and AJ don't believe him, and Clem comes up with her own story. As everyone is distracted, Molly charges at Marlon and they immediately start fighting, with Clementine joining in to help. With both of them just basically beating the brakes off of Marlon, he is forced to give up, but is still shot in the head by AJ. The votes come in and are just enough to kick Molly and Clem's group out of the school. However, Eddie is still recovering from all the blood loss and whatnot from the walker bite, and if you waited to cut his arm off at the school, well then he's in even worse shape. But regardless, Lewis tells Ruby to just finish up whatever she's working on with Eddie and try to get him stable enough to where he can be on his feet and leave. She does so, and he's left in, like I said, in a pretty bad condition. But Molly, Eddie, Clem, and AJ all get sent out into the forest and are then found by Lily and Abel. The two try to get them to join the Delta. It'd be nice to have so many new recruits, even if one of them only has one arm. Abel kind of takes offense to that, as now he only has one arm because Molly shoved him into the walkers no matter what. Clementine obviously recognizes Lily and vice versa, but Molly doesn't know who Lily is because she joined in the group pretty much shortly after Lily dipped. So Clementine would have to explain that they know each other and that she was part of their original group back way at the beginning. But no matter what, Molly does not like Lily one bit right off the bat. Clem will then either tell Violet to shoot Lily or won't. Either way, Molly would off-guard Abel and start running with everyone else. I do think that with bigger targets, AJ wouldn't be the one shot. Rather, it would be Molly who takes some of the blasts. This injures her, so they are saved by James. If you cut Eddie's arm off in the forest, James will say that he led walkers away from people last night. Of course, Clem responds by thanking him, as he saved them twice. In the morning, the four hobble back to the school, with James being there as well. He then leaves and they are brought in. With Molly being down for a while, she would be entrusting Clem to lead their group to victory. She does get healed over the time skip, so by the time of the battle, she is ready. Lily and her people bust in, and the fight begins. Eddie really can't use a bow with one arm, so he's given a makeshift weapon made by Mitch and Willie, which I think is pretty neat and fits their characters. Right from the beginning, Omar is shot in the leg with an arrow, and Mitch is stabbed in the neck by Lily. From there, Clem and Molly face off against Abel, and manage to beat him with the help of AJ. He falls off the balcony, and they climb down to help out in the rest of the fights. Clementine fights Lily, but once again, Molly's aiding her. After a while, Clem realizes that she needs to save either Lewis or Violet, and so Molly is left 1v1ing Lily for a bit, which I think would lead to some cool exchanges in dialogue. I'm not exactly sure what it would be, but these two characters seem like they would have a lot of dissonance with each other. Clem tries to save either Lewis or Violet, with Eddie also saving whoever you don't choose. And one thing I didn't actually write down, but I think it would be a cool idea to have Eddie possibly die depending on the choice you make back when you're cutting his arm off. There's no like real right answer, like should you cut his arm off sooner? He could die from blood loss on the way, or he could get eaten by walkers because, you know, you're putting everyone in danger by cutting it off in an open forest, or waiting, you know, might lead to it being too late and him dying anyway. So what I think they could do in that scenario is like have it be to where you choose and that doesn't necessarily decide the outcome. But a further thing there, like maybe the walkers come in and depending on what you do, Eddie can just die or like be left behind. And then if you didn't cut his arm off, there's a chance for like him to get like his arm infected or something on the way. I don't know. That's just kind of a cool idea. I didn't really have like a secondary idea for the one where you wait, so I'm kind of just spitballing. But I think it would be neat, since Eddie isn't like a huge part of the story, sadly, to maybe have him die depending on what you do and depending on if you fail certain things. And so in that scenario where you would have him dead, he wouldn't actually save either Lewis or Violet, so it would be Clem saving one person like in canon. But anyway, that's just something I thought I should add in because I thought it might be a cool detail. Lily and her people now retreat, making the battle mostly a success. After this, Molly and Clem interrogate Abel and learn of the Delta ship. They then plan to save everyone, recruiting James's herd of walkers. The squad makes their attack, and they save Omar and Asim during this. Molly and Clem rematch Lily, with the two coming out on top in the end, which I think would be a really cool battle. Clementine then chooses whether AJ spares Lily or shoots her. If he spares her, then James dies like in canon. The ship then explodes, and we move on to the final episode. The squad manages to get out of there, with Eddie, Ten, and Molly going with Clementine and Lewis and Violet. If they end up fighting James, both Molly and Clem together will be able to stop him. They are just a dynamic duo, beating the brakes off of everybody this season. The group then leaves the cave afterward and are forced to fight Minerva on the bridge. Here, Molly and Clem would be enough to slam her, with Eddie also helping out if he's there, now that he's got an arm weapon. She would be bitten by the walkers again, and AJ decides whether to shoot Ten or not. If he shoots him, then he dies and everyone else escapes. But if he doesn't, then Eddie will die saving Ten. And this is, of course, if you have Eddie, with that little added thing that I threw in there earlier. So now Lewis/Violet and Eddie/Ten will get separated from the group. During the Minerva fight, Clem has the backing of Molly and potentially Eddie, so there's no way that she's getting that brutal cut that Minerva gave her in canon. And even if that were the case, on their way back to the school, Molly would have her back so she wouldn't get bit. So Clementine gets to keep her leg. And with that ending, everything turns out quite a bit happier for our group. Louis and Violet are both alive and aren't blind or missing a tongue. Oh, unless I guess you had Eddie dead, so then one of them would be dead because they saved 10. Eddie or 10 will survive, and Clementine has her leg. This means that Molly successfully did her job and kept her promise to Lee to keep Clementine safe. So I think with that, if you do have Eddie alive, maybe along the course of the season, we could see somewhat of like a slight romance build between Eddie and Molly, as I think that would be a cute pairing. So maybe by the end, it ends with like Molly kissing Eddie on the cheek if he's alive or something. I don't know. But anyway, speaking of fulfilling promises, I've now fulfilled my promise to finish the series, so I'm gonna leave you guys with that. I hope you guys enjoyed all 3 parts of this story. It was crazy to write. I actually really liked writing Molly's character. She's just such an interesting person, and I've wanted to see what would happen if she actually stuck around for the longest time. I really wish I could have done more with A New Frontier, but realistically, not much would change. I'm sorry. But let me know your guys' favorite part of the series, as I think all 3 are really good. But as always, tell me if you like this series, comment your requests for future videos, and subscribe. Thank you for watching. Have a great day.